phrase on line 9 shall be fully, after the phrase shall be fully paid in cash, insert the phrase by December 31, 2019, such that the subparagraph 2 shall read as follows. 2. All pending VAT refund claims as of December 31, 2018 shall be fully paid in cash by December 31, 2019. So moved, Mr. President.
Any objection? Senator Recto.
Mr. President, we are here in the section of VAT. Section 106, if I'm not mistaken, value-added tax on sale of goods or properties.
Yes, Mr. President.
Okay. Now, I understand the nature of the amendment, and my question is, before we approve the same, who has a pending VAT refund? Because this goes to the heart of the argument in the VAT as well. And Senator Lacson and I wish to correct many of the flaws in the VAT system as well, including the chairman, Mr. President. So this is a good idea. The problem is, at the appropriate time, I think that the refund system that Senator Lacson and I are talking about will be only limited to exporters and BPO enterprises, not suppliers, exporters, not suppliers of BPO enterprises to plug the leaks VAT system, as discussed with representatives of the Department of Finance.
We'll be happy to discuss that at the appropriate time, Mr. President, when the gentlemen bring up their amendments.
Correct. But if we approve this right now, there's an implication. Who are we intending here to provide the refund? Will it be the exporters?
Yes, it's the exporters because a lot of them have pending. In fact, as we speak, there are
Yes.
exporters who have pending refunds with the.
Okay, so BPO enterprises, and that we have a suggested language later on, automatic ang refund system. Within 90 days, if the BIR, submitting all the requirements within 90 days, automatically appropriated, that all valid refund claims, you get an automatic VAT refund. That is the purpose of the VAT refund, and that is the future amendment.
The ideal, Mr. President. The problem is we have to appropriate the money here in Congress.
Yes, but if it is automatically appropriated,
Might make things easier.
it will make things easier. So there's an implication for this. And that's why the clarification lang is, who are we intending here to pay?
Well, that can be the subject of Senator Recto's future amendments, and refund. It still applies that those pending claims, if he does not disagree with this amendment, then they still have to be paid. I think the spirit of this amendment of Senator Lacson is that
Pending.
they will be paid, given the assurance that they will be paid by a certain date. Before, and there's a condition before we move to a stricter type of VAT system. They must pay all the outstanding claims, Mr. President.
Okay, with that clarification, I have no objection, Mr. President.
Any objection? Senator Drilon is recognized.
Not an objection, just a clarification. Would this particular provision require appropriations in the General Appropriations Act?
Yes, Mr. President.
So if it does, what happens if the General Appropriations Act for 2018 and 2019 would not provide for an appropriation for this VAT refund?
Yeah, it will not. We will not switch to that a different system, Mr. President, because under the current committee report, there are certain types of sales which are now which will be considered. They must pay the VAT ahead of time, then get the refund. So But we don't move to that system until they can prove that it is working efficaciously, Mr. President. That's the purpose of this provision.
I still am trying to figure out the answer to the question is the proposed amendment as amended now will read all pending VAT refund claims as of December 31, 2018 shall be paid in cash by December 31, 2019. The question we raise is, would this need appropriations in the General Appropriations Act? The response is in the affirmative. So the next question is, what happens if there are no appropriations?
May we have a 1-minute suspension, Mr. President?
Yes, sir. Session suspended.
I didn't hear your question.
Ready to resume, Mr. President.
Session resumed.
We now hear again from the sponsor, Mr. President.
Senator Angara.
Mr. President, we explained to the members during the break that this date is actually to give the government allowance, time to comply with its obligations. Because upon complying with this, then the persons listed in the section will be subject to the 12% VAT. But the people who asked for the safeguard are the exporters. Because the DOF wanted the exporters to pay the VAT and refund it. But they said, ang nangyayari po ngayon, nagbabayad po kami ng VAT, pero ilang taon bago nila makuha. So, ubos ang pera nila, talo sila. They would rather not engage in business, Mr. President. That's the fact of the matter.
Okay, so there being no objection, proposed amendment is approved.
Thank you, Mr. President. We move on to page 28 after line 7. This pertains to electric cooperatives. We'd like to insert the following paragraph after line 7. The phrase sale or exchange of services means the performance of all kinds of services in the Philippines for others for a fee, remuneration, or consideration, including those performed or rendered by construction and service contractors, stock, real estate, commercial, customs and immigration brokers, lessors of property, whether personal or real, warehousing services, lessors or distributors of cinematographic films, persons engaged in milling, processing, manufacturing or repacking goods for others, proprietors, operators, or keepers of hotels, motels, rest houses, pension houses, inns, resorts, proprietors or operators of restaurants, refreshment parlors, cafes, and other eating places, including clubs and caterers, dealers in securities, lending investors, transportation contractors, on their transport of goods and cargo or cargoes, including persons who transport goods or cargoes for hire and other domestic common carriers by land relative to their transport of goods or cargoes, common carriers by air and sea, relative to their transport of passengers, goods, or cargoes from one place in the Philippines to another place in the Philippines, sales of electricity by generation companies, transmission by any entity, and distribution companies, including electric cooperatives, services of franchise grantees of electric utilities, telephone and telegraph, radio and television broadcasting, and all other franchise grantees, except those under Section 119 of this code, and non-life insurance companies, except their crop insurances, including surety, fidelity, indemnity, and bonding companies, and similar services, regardless of whether or not the performance thereof calls for the exercise or use of the physical or mental faculties. The phrase sale or exchange of services shall likewise include and so forth. No changes henceforth. So moved, Mr. President.
Any objection? Hearing none, approved.
Mr. President, we have a similar amendment, also a Senator Lacson amendment on page 29, line 23. It's a similar amendment to the one we approved earlier. After the word by on line 23, page 29, to replace the words December 31, 2018 with December 31, 2019, such that subparagraph 2 shall read as follows. 2. All pending VAT refund claims as of December 31, 2018 shall be fully paid in cash by December 31, 2019. Again, like we explained earlier, it's to give the government a little more time to comply and for the shift to occur, Mr. President.
Any objection? Hearing none, approved.
Mr. President, we go to the excise tax on petroleum. This is a recto amendment for LPG on page 37, lines 1 and 7. To replace the word liter with kilogram as a unit of measurement. Same on page 39, lines 20 and 25, to replace the word liter, kilogram. And the same on page 42, lines 4 and 9. Same amendment, Mr. President. So
Just changing liter with kilogram.
yes, Mr. President.
Any objection? None, approved.
Mr. President, the next pertains to the excise tax on cosmetic procedures, which Senator Recto pointed out that we should not deny.
Excuse me, Mr. Sponsor. Mr. Sponsor.
Yes, Mr.
I just realized that if we change liter to kilogram, it will read per kilogram of volume capacity. Is that consistent? It's kilogram.
Yes, Mr. President, that's consistent.
That's consistent.
They are both measures of weight, units of measurement, Mr.
But
President.
not of volume. Kilogram is weight. That's correct.
Subject to style, Mr. President.
Okay, so
But perhaps the grammaticians can have...
The suggestion of Senator Aquino is to put a period after kilogram.
okay, so in effect, can we reconsider that we are replacing the phrase liter of volume capacity with kilogram, the word kilogram. Okay.
that is acceptable as well,
Okay,
Mr.
so
President.
any objection? Hearing none, approved.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Senator Aquino and Majority Leader. The next item is the excise tax on cosmetic procedures. On page 46 of the committee report, Mr. President, we are proposing the deletion of lines 1 to 21, or the entire section 30, which would have introduced a cosmetic surgery tax in recognition of Senator Recto's the right of certain persons to improve their appearance, Mr. President. But seriously speaking, Mr. President, the DOF has asked for time to study this because they feel it might be difficult to implement because of the drawing of lines as to which are taxable or not, or which would be, we might be placing doctors in difficult territory also, Mr. President. So I so move. I so move for that deletion, Mr. President.
Senator Recto?
I agree with the sponsor. And as I mentioned earlier during the period of interpellations, kung nagpapaganda, wag natin i-tax. Pag nagpapapangit, i-tax natin.
Mr. President, hindi po ba yung mga nagpapaganda may mga pera? Bakit natin i-exempt or hindi natin tatax?
They're actually not exempt because they're subject to normal taxes. This is just
Pardon the word, but ba't natin hindi tatasan tax?
it is this section would have proposed an excise tax, and well, they're subject to the regular taxes, but this would have been an excise tax in just like cigarettes and alcohol and yachts, and the DOF is saying if they could study the matter further, Mr. President. So,
In other words, Mr. President, if I may, the proposal of the sponsor is to merely retain the present taxation.
that's correct, Mr. President.
This is what is being deleted is an additional tax. No? All right, thank you.
But is there an objection? Senator
Just
Lacson?
a clarificatory question. How much will be the leakage? No, actually, walang leakage. Pero kung sa under the proposal, merong additional tax, may leakage din. Prospectively. That's what I'm asking. Mr.
Foregone revenues.
That's 10B.
It's 10B, but they're not sure because they don't know which ones are medical purposes. That's one reason why they're saying it's difficult to administer. Because under the committee report, it says if it is to restore normal bodily functions, meaning it's medically necessary, na-aksidente yung tao, or he has a cleft palate, that would be exempt from under the committee report, Mr. President.
Mine is not a violent objection, Mr. President. Just, it's just a thought.
Yes, Mr. President, we're not totally eliminating it, but I think the DOF is asking for time to study and to craft a more foolproof system, Mr. President. I think that is what the intention is.
Not as of this moment. Yes. Okay. Any objection to the motion? There being none, the amendment is approved.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, we have the next ones are the Zubiri amendments on page 47, line 10, pertaining to the sugar-sweetened beverages. We'll delete the words and numbers 3 pesos and replace the words and numbers 5 pesos so that the concerned paragraph will read, a tax of 5 pesos per liter of volume capacity shall be levied, assessed, and collected on sweetened beverages using purely non-caloric sweeteners or a mix of caloric and non-caloric sweeteners, provided that sweetened beverages using purely stevia glycoside shall be exempt from this tax. We so move, Mr. President.
Senator Aquino.
Mr. President,
Senator Aquino.
Yes, Mr. President, maybe before we tackle the amendment, I'd just like some clarificatory questions on the amendments. Mr.
Certainly, Mr. President, gentleman from
So,
Tarlac.
Mr. President, the debate on this particular provision is really on should we be measuring per liter or per gram. No? And currently, Mr. President, we have a hybrid model. That's correct, Mr. President, where for the first 2 years, we're measuring it based on the liquid volume, and after 2 years, we start measuring based on a content volume. May I know, Mr. President, for the record, why we don't just have one system in the law, and why do we have two systems?
It's a good question, Mr. President, and we had several hearings on this. In fact, this representation, to be quite candid, was more inclined towards a sugar content system because, in a way, it would be more precise. But unfortunately, our Food and Drug Administration said they do not have the capacity, the number of people, and the number of or the equipment necessary to measure the sugar content of these beverages.
Right,
Mr.
Mr. President. So the 2 years presupposes that in 2 years' time, we have the capacity to measure the content of sugar in our products.
We're actually repealing the 2 years, the move to the sugar content,
So
Mr.
your
President.
intent is to...
There is a subsequent amendment after this to keep the volume. Again, it's not the most ideal system, but given the constraints, we have to be practical, and that would be the best given the state of equipment of our. And perhaps later on, then we can move. We can decide to move to a different system or paradigm if initial conditions change, Mr. President.
So the intent, Mr. President, is to keep the per volume measurement of this excise tax.
Yes, Mr. President.
All right, Mr. President. Well, of course, my questions would have been regarding the distortion in the prices that would happen if you used two different systems and change it after 2 years, no? But of course, that's moot now, Mr. President, if you intend to just take out the second system altogether. But, Mr. President...
But that taking out is, I'd like to just note, Mr. President, with the indulgence of the gentleman, is this the next amendment? The move
Yes.
from, this one is just the change in the pricing.
Yes.
It's the 3 pesos to the 5 pesos.
I'm tackling it, Mr. President, because I think our agreement is if the questions or the amendments are to the heart of the matter, we can raise it already at this point. And talking about which system to adopt, of course, goes to the heart of the matter, Mr. President. So in this case, Mr. President, your recommendation is just to stick to the per volume measurement. But, Mr. President, in those hearings that we've had, weren't there already admissions from practically all the parties that this would not distinguish anymore between products with high sugar content and low sugar content as long as they are in packaging which is of a liter in capacity, Mr. President? So wouldn't that be a less than ideal way to measure sugar beverages, Mr. President?
It's not the perfect system, Mr. President, but many countries have adopted it. And given the state, as I said, the initial conditions present in the country, it would be difficult to go for the optimal when your taxing authorities are not capable of implementing it, Mr. President.
Mr. President, was there a commitment from the FDA, for example, that within X months or X years that they would have the capability to measure the content, the sugar content of these products? These are also commonly done in other countries, Mr. President.
Yes, they said that they might be able to do it, but talking to the DOF, they said they prefer the per volume because it's much easier to administer.
Was there a commitment given, Mr. President, or even just an estimate on how long it would take the FDA if we were to choose a per content, sugar content system, how long it would take them to come up with that measurement mechanism, Mr. President? Was that discussed?
No exact date given, Mr. President. But it also dependent actually on congressional action because their budget does not include any type of... so perhaps after we decide on which system we'd like to go through and we want to move to sugar content, then perhaps we should empower the FDA because right now they're not empowered.
So in short, Mr. President, you're saying that if we decide to go for a content-based mechanism, we would need to also fund the FDA to be able to do that.
That's right, Mr. President.
And would it take them more than a year or 2 years to come up with that mechanism? I'm sure that was discussed, Mr. President.
That's why we put the 2 years, is because they said they might be able to do it in 2 years. But then again, the DOF has some reservations about that.
And
Mr.
that's
President.
assuming, Mr. President, obviously it assumes we don't trust the stated amounts of the companies who produce these products. Because you want to double check what they actually state in their
Yes,
labels.
it would be difficult to just rely on their good intentions, Mr. President. And
But there are penalties, Mr. President. I'm sure, I think this is part of the provisions that you want to amend, but there are penalties for lying. No?
But, Mr. President, to actually impose and to decide whether there have been violations, you would need equipment which is currently not within their
Yes.
possession.
But for example, Mr. President, if the law is effective January of 2018 and they pay based on their stated content, in 2 years' time, the FDA has the capacity to measure, they measure, and if they were lying, they would be penalized, Mr. President. So hindi naman sila completely scot-free, even if it takes a few years to be able to measure. Or wouldn't we be able to seek the assistance of a third-party laboratory to measure that, Mr. President?
All of these ideas from the gentleman are possible, and but again, there are trade-offs to be made, and I think the trade-off here is between administrative simplicity and the certainty of revenue, Mr. President. And the DOF is asking us to go for
Certainty
administrative
of revenue.
simplicity and certainty of revenue.
All right. Mr. President, so 2 products that have the same sugar content, but one is packaged in a 355 ml can and one is packaged in a 1 liter bottle, would they have a different, would they have the same tax rate, Mr. President? Or
It's the same tax rate, but it would be prorated for the 355 milliliter. He won't be taxed the 5 pesos. He'll be taxed the 5 peso prorated by
Over
the
3,
355.
probably.
Yes.
Yes, even if they have the same sugar content, Mr. President.
Even if they have the same sugar content, because it's a different measurement. You're comparing apples and oranges, Mr. President. So the purpose of prorating is to come up with to compare apples to apples and oranges to oranges.
Actually, Mr. President, that's really my concern because if the measure is an excise tax on sugar-sweetened beverages, not on the volume of the packaging of these beverages. Because, Mr. President, if we use a per liter system, we're actually, the standard that we're using is how big the packaging materials are, not on the percentage of sugar in these products, Mr. President. Is that correct?
Not necessarily, because if they use a sachet, then that sachet would not be subject to the 5 peso rate, which that applies to the 1 liter. It will be prorated. So his tax will be prorated.
All right. So, anyway, Mr. President, so just procedurally, the committee is adamant to use the per liter system, Mr. President. I mean, that is already the determination of the committee, of the chairman.
It is subject to the body's approval, Mr. President, and that's the next amendment. The current amendment on the floor right now is just to subject the non-caloric sweeteners to the same rate as the caloric sweeteners. That's the only amendment before the body right now, Mr. President.
All right. But shortly after, Mr. President, the
Yes,
provisions-
we will be moving to remove the application of the sugar content system after 2 years. That's the next amendment, Mr.
All right.
President.
Maybe at the proper time, Mr. President, we can make the proper motion. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, gentleman from Tarlac.
Senator Gatchalian, you wanted to be recognized. Senator Gatchalian is recognized.
Mr. President, I'll wait for the next provision before I inquire and ask questions.
Else?
Maybe just, Mr. President, because that's my amendment on, that's being discussed, Mr. President. We just want to level the playing field for the sugar industry when it comes to sugar sweeteners. I feel that if the sugar industry or our own Filipino-made sugar is taxed at 5 pesos, I believe that sweeteners such as Equal and all the other Zaccharin will be taxed the same. So equal playing field lang po, Mr. President. That's why I proposed that measure. Right now, the sugar industry is hitting one of its low points at 1,100 pesos per bag of 50 kilo bag of sugar, Mr. President. Negros, Bukidnon, Northern Cebu, Iloilo, many of our farmers are having a difficult time surviving now. The price per kilo, price per bag, price production per bag, Mr. President, is already 900 pesos. So the income is very small. Another hit to the sugar industry will actually affect about 5 million Filipino farmers, Mr. President. And that's why I made this amendment. Thank you.
Senator Ontiveros.
Thank you, Mr. President. Just to put on the record with a good sponsor that at the proper time, I will be proposing amendments that would run contrary to the elimination of the content-based or grams-based system of applying this tax. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator Aquino.
President, on this particular provision, I'd just like to be clarified, Mr. President. Initially, the reasons why we opted for an excise tax on sugar sweetened beverages is really on health measures, Mr. President. Is that correct?
Well, that was the repeated mantra of the government authorities before us. Pero kung magpapakatotoo po tayo, mukhang revenue measure din siya ho.
So in short, Mr. President, it's not really health. Because though I understand Senator Zubili's concern with this, this measure, it's really putting at parity the market. No, you want to put at parity the products which contain sugar and the products which it competes with, which do not contain sugar. Because if you talk about taxing this also, Mr. President, this does not fall within the ambit anymore of the idea of taxing sugar-sweetened beverages. No. But just to make it clear, I'm not necessarily against it, Mr. President, but I want it on the record that this is the idea of this particular provision.
Yes, but if you think about it, Mr. President, yung substitute sweeteners are even more dangerous. They're cancer-causing. You're talking about Zaccharin, you're talking about NutraSweet, you're talking about Equal. I just read actually an article on the 8 things that you shouldn't eat that causes cancer. And number 2 of that was sugar substitutes. So number 4 pa yata yung sugar. Number 2 yung sugar substitutes. So if it's a health measure, Mr. President, I think
it's difficult to really put them in either a health box or a revenue box because it will also help the amount is calculated to also dissuade people and to change consumption. So in that sense, it is a revenue, it is a health measure. But given that it's easy to administer, that's why the DOF prefers it. It is a revenue measure. So I think it's a false dichotomy to say that it has to be one or the other because it's both.
Well, Mr. President, just on that note, Mr. President, I'm diabetic. No? There are some of us here who are also diabetic. And the doctor's advice is not to take anything with too much sugar, and if you can substitute it with stevia or these other things, Mr. President. But, Mr. President, the determination of the health risks or benefits of these products is not the same as sugar. Now, I'm not necessarily against this, Mr. President. I'm just saying that this particular amendment is putting at parity products which compete with each other. And maybe, Mr. President, what the chairman is saying, maybe this is, we cannot clearly say that this particular amendment is a health measure. It's not. I mean, just for the record, Mr. President.
No, I'm not willing to concede that, Mr. President. I'm saying you can't just say it's either a health measure or a revenue measure because it can be both.
Mr. President, I hate to disagree, but I think this is a revenue measure or provision. If you really, no matter what how you look at it, because if you really want to tax sugar, then you tax rice. Yan yung pinakamalaki sugar eh.
And the highest content of sugar in our diets, Mr. President, no, is white rice.
So the President Pro Tem, Mr. President.
Go ahead, Senator Recto, go ahead.
Mr. President, if I may respond to that statement about rice. That was raised during the hearings. And it was said that the doctor said that rice actually has nutritional value. Despite what is bad is an overdose of rice. Yung only rice na some of our colleagues are familiar with. But rice per se has nutritional value, unlike some of the sugar-sweetened beverages, which to them are empty calories. So that's on the record in our hearings, Mr. President.
So, Mr. President, so just for the record, Mr. President, we are taxing non-caloric sweeteners because we want to raise more revenue from these products. Simply put, Mr. President.
Also because the sugar producers of the country requested that they not be put at a disadvantage with respect to the producers of these, which are mostly imported, Mr. President.
Yes, well, Mr. President, that's it. So it is a measure of, and again, I'm not necessarily against it, Mr. President. I just want it to be clear. This is a revenue measure. It's a measure to protect the sugar industry. Of course, Mr. President, the other way that they could have lobbied is to lower the excise taxes on their products. No? I mean, that's the other way to lobby for it. Rather than itaas mo yung presyo ng ibang mga produkto, babaan mo yung tax sa yung produkto. But they opted for this, Mr. President, as this seems to be the order of the day. And in effect, Mr. President, we have this amendment which is increasing the final price of products which don't necessarily include sugar, but are within the provision of sugar-sweetened beverages, Mr. President. I mean, just for the record, Mr. President. In effect, that's what's happening, Mr. President.
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. For the record, Mr. President.
Senator Recto.
Mr. President, this is probably the most controversial issue in the bill. Sugar. In the first place, maraming tatamaan dito. You include the sari-sari stores. You include the D&E consumers who consume these products the most, as presented during the period of interpellations, Mr. President, if you recall. Having said that, Mr. President, we're talking about three things here. One is this a revenue measure or a health measure? Let me start with that, Mr. President. Essentially, my position is the same as the majority leader. This is a revenue measure. Why? If it were a health measure, and we were serious about taxing sugar, then we tax it in the plant. We tax it sa milling. Ilan lang yung miller na kukolekte mo dyan. That way, the downstream industry, kahit sa hotel pa yung beverage na yan, or whatever sugar, kahit cake yan, makukolekta mo yung sugar tax na yan. But here, the position really of government is build, build, build. And the best way to collect it, simply put, is volume of liter.
Correct, Mr. President.
So administratively, it is easier to collect. Now, if you put too many rates, may 3, 5, 10, whatever it is, plus sugar content, may FDA pa, baka wala na tayo makolekta dyan. Magbabago taon-taon yan. For simplicity, I agree with the chairman and the DOF. Volume of liter. Now, this is really a non-alcoholic beverage that we're taxing. We shouldn't even call it a sugar-sweetened beverage. It is really non-alcoholic that we're taxing here. Now, I think the amendment is, if I recall, the House version is 5 and 10. Is that correct?
It's 10 and 20, Mr.
It's
President.
10 and 20. Yeah. The Senate version is 5 and 10.
Senate version right now, as it stands before the approval of this, is 5, 3, and 10, Mr. President.
5, 3, and 10.
Yes.
My proposal is simple, as I mentioned during the interpellations. In fact, I would just delete many of the sections here and just say, there shall be levied, assessed, and collected an excise tax of 3 pesos per liter of volume capacity on all sweetened beverages effective January 1, 2018. And delete many of these others here about talking about caloric, non-caloric, because it's really non-alcoholic beverages. Now, what are these products ba? And then, of course, exempt milk and 3-in-1 coffee. Okay? Water is not included. Okay? Now, the question now is, assuming we agree already on volume, what will be the rate? At 10 pesos a liter, there is an elasticity factor of 40%. Volumes will drop by 40%. Maraming pwede ma-displace sa trabaho. Masyadong tataas ang presyo, volumes will drop, babagsak ang benta ng sari-sari store. And hindi ka pa sigurado na makokolekta ng gobyerno. Because how many companies are they going to collect this from? Do they even know, as we discussed during the period of interpellations? Where are they located? Do they have a plan? Now, the prudent thing to do is to have a lower rate and ensure we collect. We are not creating many mighties also in the sweetened beverage category. Now, at 5 pesos, the elasticity is roughly 20%. Now, at 3 pesos, pantay-pantay lahat. Walang pinipili, walang pogi, walang pangit. Pare-pareho lahat, 3 pesos, madaling i-collect. Yung elasticity factor is only 12%. Mas madali rin makolekta ng gobyerno. Government should not be too greedy and not collect anything also. Now, with that proposal, maybe I can ask because I've run all these numbers with the DOF. At 3 pesos, you could collect 23.5 billion. Is that correct?
Yes, Mr. President.
Okay. And is it correct to say that there's less disruption in the industry? Less disruption. And that there could be future planning for growth.
Or tax would be preferred by the industry, Mr.
Diba?
President. Definitely.
Parang dapat mag-isip tayo, parang negosyanteng Chinese. Konting taas, volume, magandang sales natin. Dapat ganun din mag-isip ang gobyerno. Hindi laging one time, big time. Banatan natin ng banatan, babagsak yung industriya. Hindi mo alam kung saan i-kolekta, and then you'll be creating so many people who are not paying taxes. And then you're not disrupting also the sari-sari stores too much. Am I correct, Mr. Chairman?
I'm sorry, what was the last statement of the
The
gentleman?
last statement is that at 3 pesos, you're not disrupting the sari-sari stores.
I think the 5 pesos, Mr. President, is probably the sweet spot because the literature tells us that a 20% tax, a tax of 20% of the price is enough to change behavior. So that's where the health comes in. If it's too low, you do not change behavior. But if it's 20% or thereabouts, then you're changing behavior. You're discouraging people from drinking these beverages.
Again, Mr. President, we all know that this is a revenue measure because kung health measure to, then I'll make another proposal. Ipropose ba natin that let's collect talagang sugar tax? Health proposal pala eh, if it's really a health proposal eh.
As I said earlier, Mr. President, it's not just one or the other in response to the gentleman from Tarlac. Although, with the move, if we move to a volume, mas mananaig yung revenue aspect niya.
Okay. So let me again put for the record. Am I correct to say that at 10 pesos, there's an elasticity factor of roughly 40%?
Have to ask the economists, Mr. President.
Well,
I'm
they
looking
made
at
all these numbers.
I'm looking at Yusek Carl, who is a PhD in economics.
Okay, so what is the volume today in the market?
The volume of consumption of
Yes.
sugar-sweetened beverages.
In volume liters. What is the volume today?
Can we ask for a 1-minute suspension while they retrieve the data, Mr. President?
Yes.
Session suspended.
CR na rin ako.